A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hi there, everyone. This is David McKnight, best-selling author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You LERP, The Volatility Shield, and the upcoming book, Tax-Free Income for Life. Welcome to the Power of Zero show. If you're looking for someone to help you navigate all of the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, head on over to davidmcknight.com. And if you are an advisor who would like to transition your practice to a Power of Zero type practice, head over to powerofzero.com. Today we are going to talk about why we cannot print our way out of our problems. Now, this may seem obvious. Its name may seem obvious that a government can't simply print nearly unlimited amounts of money to be able to buy whatever they want. But there's actually a very specific reason I bring this concept up, because there's a book that has come out recently by Dr. Stephanie Kelton, who is a professor at Stony Brook College. I think it's near Boston. Stephanie Kelton and I she wrote a book called The Deficit Myth. We happen to share the same literary agent. So this is a great irony of all this, that my agent, Howard Yoon, is also the agent for Stephanie Kelton and also The Power of Zero and Tax-Free Income for Life. I've given him some ribbing over this. But basically, the main premise of Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, is this: that because the government issues its own currency, it doesn't operate like a traditional household might. So in other words, it doesn't have to operate within a budget, because if it runs out of money, it can simply print more of it. So in theory, if you can print as much money as you need, you can pay for all of those government programs that you've always wanted. You can pay for the interest on the national debt. You could even liquidate the national debt if you wanted to. All you would have to do currently is to print about $27 trillion, and then you can simply liquidate all that national debt overnight. And of course, if you wanted to pay for unfunded obligations like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all you'd have to do is print $239 trillion, and that would fund you through the next 75 years. So the long and the short of it is, it doesn't matter what your country's fiscal gap is. It doesn't matter what your deficits are. It doesn't matter what your debt is. You can simply pay for precisely what you need, because you will never, ever run out of money. We know that the states in our country have this problem. They can't print their own currency, so they actually have to live within a budget. She maintains that the federal government does not have to live within a budget, because they can simply print more money when they run out of cash. They can pay for things like the Green New Deal, which has a price tag of about $93 trillion. They can guarantee that every American have a job. And if not that, they can guarantee universal basic income, which is basically what Andrew Yang was proposing while he was running for president. You can guarantee that everyone gets at least $15 per hour of minimum wage. This whole idea that you can simply print your way out of your problems is what's called modern monetary theory, or MMT. For those of you who have watched The Power of Zero, The Tax Train is Coming, this is the answer that poor girl that Neil Cavuto was interviewing should have come up with. So Neil Cavuto is interviewing this girl who is marching on campuses across the country saying that student loans need to be forgiven, campus jobs need to be paid $15 an hour, and school should basically be free. And then he said, "How are you proposing paying for this?" And she got caught flat-footed, and she didn't really have an answer. She was tongue-tied. Had she really been on her toes, she would have just simply taken some cues from her MMT comrades and said, "We'll simply print the money. We'll print our way out of our problems." Now, you may be thinking, okay, now, so if you've got really smart people that are proposing this, that they have answers to all of the typical responses that people might have to these harebrained schemes. One of the things that people say is that it's okay to inflate the money as long as the inflation of the money supply has a commensurate impact on the economy. In other words, if you're injecting all of this money into the economy, and it increases GDP, it increases productivity, increases jobs and production and all that good stuff, then all you've really done is make the pie bigger, and everybody benefits when the pie is bigger. Companies can produce more goods and services, then you have a larger amount of money chasing in an equivalently large amount of goods and services. As a result, you wouldn't have necessarily, in that case, inflation. You would just have a bigger pie. You'd have a bigger economy, and everybody benefits from an expanded economy. So this is the sophistry that you're against, and herein lies the problem. What are the types of things that they're proposing doing with all that printed money? Are those the types of things that truly expand the economy? Are those the types of things that truly create productivity? If you're guaranteeing a minimum wage of $15 up from, $7.25 right now, you aren't necessarily increasing productivity. In fact, you're making it more expensive to run a business. If you are paying $93 trillion for a Green New Deal, that's not necessarily creating more productivity. So that injection of that money into the economy to pay for all of these different initiatives is not necessarily giving you that commensurate growth in the economy that you might experience were real productivity created by innovation and the productivity that typically goes along with a free market economy. The government can't, for example, guarantee that a job that it creates is going to benefit the economy in the same way that a private enterprise, when they create a job, can grow the economy. Generally, when a private enterprise creates a job, it's because they are expanding. They are creating products that people are consuming, and that is actually growing the economy. If you don't believe me that the government's not very good at creating jobs that expand the economy. In other words, they're not very good at picking winners and losers. Think back to Solyndra. The government tends not to allocate resources efficiently in the same way that a public enterprise might when they have to show allegiance to stockholders, so on and so forth. Here's another example for you. Think back to Elon Musk. What did he just do? He just sent 2 astronauts into space. It was the first privately crewed flight in NASA's commercial crew program. In fact, Obama's administration, I'm not being political in any way, I'm just trying to create a contrast here. Obama says, look, to create something like this in the private sector would take 10 years, or actually it was 12 years, and cost $23 billion. Elon Musk did it in 6 years at the cost of $1 billion. So you can see that when private enterprise where they're responsible to their stockholders get a hold of something, they tend to do it much more efficiently than the government counterpart. Is there criticism of MMT? Yeah, all you got to do is type into the internet criticism of modern monetary theory. In fact, some of the biggest criticism comes from some of the more famous economists on the left-hand side of the aisle. For example, Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman has been strongly opposed to the theory. In a New York Times op-ed in 2011, he warned the U.S. would see hyperinflation if it was put into practice and investors refused to buy bonds. Remember, if nobody buys our bonds, then inflating the money supply is our only option. Let me repeat that. If nobody buys our bonds, then inflating the money supply is our only option. And what happens with hyperinflation is nobody wants to buy our bonds, okay? Because the bonds become immediately worthless overnight. So nobody wants to hold these bonds that are likely to become immediately worthless. So then what happens is, if nobody buys your bonds, then it's this vicious cycle where you have to continue to print money, which continues to drive inflation upward, which means that you have, for all intents and purposes, a stealth tax. People say, hey, look, you don't have to raise taxes. You can just print your way out of the problem. The problem is inflation is a type of tax, but it's more insidious than a tax increase, because at least with the tax increase, your representatives have to vote on it. They have to put their electability on the line. They have to respond. They have to be accountable to their constituents by making a decision to raise taxes. There is no legislative procedure that goes into printing more money. It's just quantitative easing. It's just something that happens. But it's like an insidious hidden tax, because what happens is it devalues your money. It devalues your money in the same way that tax decreases your spending power, but it does so without any legislation at all. And it actually affects the poor in a disproportionate way. Typically, the poor are the beneficiaries of much lower tax rates, but if you are devaluing or decreasing their spending power on those who normally enjoy very low tax rates, then they are being disproportionately affected by inflation. Okay, let's talk briefly about what happens if we try to print money to pay off the national debt or to at least pay interest on the national debt. Watch what happens. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple of bullet points. First of all, if the government printed money to pay off the national debt, we know that inflation would rise. Paul Krugman has talked about hyperinflation. This increase in inflation will reduce the value of the U.S. bonds. We talked about why. As inflation goes up, the value of those bonds goes down. And these are bonds that are held by Americans and governments around the world. So you would have a sovereign debt crisis. What's a sovereign debt crisis again? A sovereign debt crisis is when other countries stop buying our debt because they don't believe we can pay it back, or because they believe that the value of those bonds will decrease dramatically and it won't be a good deal for them. Second point, if inflation increases, people will not want to hold the bonds because their value is falling. We've talked about that. Third point, therefore, the government will find it difficult to sell more bonds to finance the national debt. They will have to pay higher interest rates to attract investors. And what happens when you raise interest rates? The cost of servicing all that debt increases and crowds out all the other line items in the budget. So if you remember from our movie, The Power Zero, the Tax Rate is Coming, he talks about, George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Reagan, talks about how we are getting to a point where the cost of renting the money that we've already spent is crowding out all the other items in the budget. And as interest rates go up along with inflation, then we will no longer have the ability to pay for basic things, park services, FBI, Smithsonian, all those normal things are going to be crowded out of the budget. You could then print more money to solve the problem in the short term, but then it quickly becomes a vicious cycle where more printing brings on more inflation. And if the government prints too much money, inflation gets out of hand, investors will not trust the government, and it will be hard for the government to borrow anything at all. Therefore, as we see, printing money creates more problems than it solves. There's another problem. You got to remember that what are the three programs that are driving all of our national debt? Why is the national debt going up by $1 trillion per year? Why will it be going up by $2 trillion per year in 2030? Why will it be going up by $3 trillion per year in 2035? And why will it be going up by $6 trillion per year by 2055? Because Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are the two unfunded obligations that are driving all this debt. If we try to print money to pay for these three programs to avoid adding to the national debt, what happens? You got to remember that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are all tied to inflation. As we inflate the money supply and inflation goes up, the cost of these three programs rise commensurately. So if you double the supply of money to try to pay for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, you essentially at the same time will double the cost of these programs. So it's like a dog chasing its tail and never ever really catches up. What am I getting at here, folks? What I'm getting at is simply the following. We cannot print our way out of our problems. We can't print our way out of the Social Security problem. We can't print our way out of the Medicare problem. We can't print our way out of the Medicaid problem. And before long, we will have so much debt that the cost of servicing all that debt will crowd out all of the other expenses, and the federal government will have no choice but to raise taxes, because they will soon recognize that printing their way out of the problem is not a viable solution. So they'll have to raise more revenue. So the bottom line is, not only do I strenuously disagree with Stephanie Kelton's premise, but I think it's very dangerous for our country, particularly since she has this, because she's positing that we can print money to pay for pretty much anything, that there's in that paradigm, in that worldview, there's no real urgency to liquidate the national debt. So the national debt will continue to grow and compound over time. As interest rates go up, with inflation going up, then the cost of servicing that debt becomes more and more prohibitive. And I've already done one podcast on what happens if we default on our national debt. It's a very dangerous approach. It's a very dangerous worldview. And I think that we are rightfully seeing huge slapdowns from the likes of Wall Street Journal and from the Cato Institute talking about how dangerous this approach is. The long and the short of it is we just need to be fiscally responsible. We need to raise more revenue. We need to cut spending. We need to stop eating the dessert before we eat the spinach. We need to respect the financial laws of the universe. You can't break the financial laws of the universe without unintended consequences, without repercussions. These are all things that I know resonate with you. These are all things that I know feel right in the gut of your stomach, right? Or in the pit of your stomach, in your gut, that it feels right that you should not spend more than what you have coming in. And so when we see these types of approaches that say, hey, because we issue our own currency, because we issue debt in our own currency, we can do whatever we want. If that doesn't sound right to you, if it doesn't seem right to you, it's because it's not right. And lots of economists have weighed in on the hyperinflation that would ensue if we pursued this course. All right, folks, that's it for today. Remember, we can't print our way out of our problems. We can only either cut spending, raise revenue, or some combination of the two. I would love a follow on Twitter. If you are into Twitter, it's at McKnight & Co., at McKnight & Co. You can follow me on Instagram as well. And certainly I would love any sort of reviews on Amazon or iTunes for our books or our podcast or our movie. And then my final call to action for you is to go ahead and buy my book, pre-order my book, Tax-Free Income for Life on Amazon. Please order the hard copy. If we're trying to make it a New York Times bestseller, the Kindle version and the Audible version don't count towards that. So get the hardback. If you go over to davidmcknight.com, you can input your receipt number and you can get your Chapter 1 downloaded immediately. So you don't have to wait till November 17th. You can download it immediately. Thanks for being with me today, and we will look forward to talking to you same time next week. Talk to you soon.